Hi, and welcome to part 3 of the Courageous Decade. I'm Vanessa Couto, life purpose coach and astrologer. And in part 3, we continue to explore the bigger cycles of this decade that make this decade quite the transformative paradigm shift epoch, the beginning of a new epoch. So in this part, we're going to be talking about the Air Epoch, the Great Mutation. And this all started back with the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn on the winter solstice in the Northern Hemisphere back in December of 2020. Until then, Jupiter and Saturn had been joining forces every 20 years or so in Earth signs, such as Capricorn, Virgo, and Taurus. And it all had started in 1802. So from 1802 to the year 2000, Jupiter and Saturn, every 20 years or so, would conjoin in Earth. In these last 200 years, we saw a great advancement in scientific and technological developments. Think about the 1800s, the Victorian age, the industrial age, the machines, how much the world has, in a way, become smaller through technology. And there was also the time of the expansion of capitalism in the way that we understand it now, and an approach to life that focused on pragmatism, very material. Things needed to be proven. It's all about numbers. Otherwise, it's not considered real. So the paradigm in the last 200 years was of cause and effect. And the holy grail that everybody wanted, it was a proof through numbers and data. Now, here's the interesting thing. So back in the late, so now the conjunction happens in air. So Jupiter and Saturn conjoin on the solstice of 2020 at 0 degrees of Aquarius. And just think about this, every time it's a 0 degrees of a sign, it's quite the critical point because it's the beginning, the real beginning of that realm of experience. I always invite my students and clients to think about the signs as a realm of experience. Now, when Jupiter and Saturn join forces, they do have this element in which they do shape history. Both of them represent societal changes. That's why they're often linked to the idea of the king is dead, long live the king. There's a sense of shift in power. At a more personal level, they can also represent how we reimagine our careers, our work in the world. So if you look back to 2020, 2021, we heard a lot about the Great Resignation. People were rethinking how they interacted with their work. But on a larger cultural scale, Jupiter and Saturn have a lot to say about human development, the interaction between ideas and potentialities, possibilities that will take their manifestation in the concrete material world. Think of Jupiter as the expansion, the opportunity, the possibilities, and Saturn, the concept, the idea of bringing it down, grounding it down into the material world. I like to think of Saturn as the great astrological midwife, and as well as the birth canal. Both of them have a lot to do with development and the evolution of social structures, coupled with a sense of corporate. The origin of the word corporate here coming from corpus, meaning body, and it's also related to the sense of national identity. So if you look to the last 3-4 years, how much we've been speaking to countries who are rethinking their national identity. We've been seeing a lot around corporations, literally corporations. So there's a lot that new ideas, new structures are being thought, reimagined. Now, because this is a big shift, is, like I said, for 200 years, Jupiter and Saturn are pretty much just joining forces in Earth signs. Just before, in the year 2000, when they joined forces in Taurus, which was the last time they joined forces in the Earth sign. Just before that cycle, 20 years before, they did join forces in Libra. And so that was kind of the beginning, the little taste of a shift. But now going forward, 2020, to the next 200 years, they will be joining forces in air signs. So that's going to be Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. So here we are in an epoch shift because it's a 200-year dynamic that is changing. So here we are opening ourselves up to new discoveries, new visions, ideals, social trends, because air signs are much more related to the mind, to the ideas, to connection. The image we're starting to get now is of social networks. And I don't mean this as in the social media platforms, way beyond that. So we're looking at how one idea is born in one place and ripples out further afield than we could possibly imagine. So what we're facing now in the world is not necessarily just a crisis, although you can see a crisis as an opportunity, but it's really an epoch shift. So if you haven't watched videos 1 and 2, part 1 and 2, I invite you to go back, especially to part 2, to see about the long astrological cycles, especially of Pluto and Neptune that join forces every 492 years. And the last time they joined forces was in the late 1800s in Gemini. So there you have already another underlying theme of air, of the air signs. So the German astrologer Alexander von Schiffen, he says, culture is an expression of the soul of an epoch. So in looking to culture, because Jupiter and Saturn really speak to cultural shifts, you have a sense of what is really the soul of this new epoch. Where are the news, the themes that are popping out? Look to the movies, the conversations. What are the ideas that are spreading? And that will give us a sense of what is this epoch about? What are the big questions we're going to be asking? And what is the story, the unifying story that we're needing, or maybe we're helping take shape? So this is the epoch of transition. So whenever we're navigating transition, and I think this is an element that ties in with the idea of a crisis, because a crisis is a breaking point in which invites shift, transformations. And whenever we are in transition and in transformation, we are in a liminal stage, right? We are crossing different waters. We're leaving the old ways, but the new ways are not fully formed yet. So there's a sense of being in flux. And this is especially true in the early stages of a transition, because the sense we get is a massive disorientation, because we're moving away from something we've gotten used to, but it's dying out. Think about this. Every transition, however big or small, starts with death. Something is dying, something is ending. And then it moves into sort of the unknown waters before it is reborn on the other side. Transitions don't necessarily begin with a birth. They often begin with something dying. That's something to keep in mind and to reflect on. Now, because this union of Jupiter and Saturn happened at 0 degrees of Aquarius, that point becomes a major imprint into the whole 200-year cycle. Because that point becomes, as you might think, as a sensitive place. So more recently, we've had Pluto coming into 0 degrees of Aquarius. So it's touching on that point, really bringing out the themes of this air epoch. And of course, much like a birthday chart, your birth chart, this is the birth chart of the whole epoch. So 0 degrees of Aquarius becomes kind of underlines the whole 200 years. We're going to keep going back to this place again and again and revisiting it. Just to keep in mind for those of you who like histories, take a look at what was going on between the years 1226 and 1405, because this was the last time we had an air epoch. We were in the high Middle Ages. There was a major moment of transitions, new technologies, the Crusades, connection, unfortunately, a lot through war, but also commerce between different peoples, different religions, that brought new ideas, which led to new scientific and philosophical developments later on. Think of the Renaissance. So the air epoch right there, if you look at history, already gives us a glimpse of what is possible. It's not so much that history repeats itself, but it surely has a sense of connection and resonance to themes. As I said, Saturn, Aquarius is going to be a major influence and imprint in this whole epoch. And the rulers of Aquarius, that is Uranus, the more modern ruler, but also Saturn, that was the ancient ruler of Aquarius, will be part of this imprint and this influence. So we're going to be looking a lot at the transits of Uranus, the transits of Saturn, to give us a sense of what the epoch is about. So in short, the whole epoch, even 20 years from now, 40 years from now, as Jupiter and Saturn conjoin in other air signs, it's still going, the whole epoch is going to have this Aquarian quality to it, which to me, although the Aquarian age, we don't have a date of when it starts per se, but I have a sense that more and more we're moving into the Aquarian age. First, it's this epoch transition, Pluto in Aquarius. So there's a lot of already of Aquarian energy in the zeitgeist. So some considerations just in terms of themes for both Saturn and Uranus. Think of Saturn as the idea of boundary and consequences. You do something, it leads to consequences. I also like to think of Saturn, as I just said before, as both the birth canal and the midwife of things that we're bringing into the world, right? It's sort of the coagulation of an idea. While Uranus has the element of crossing the line, of breaking the boundary, or going beyond what has been established. So you can see right here that Saturn and Uranus are complex company to each other. You know, they can work well together, I think, but it has to have a strong level of respect. While Saturn tends to want to conserve, to maintain, to establish, Uranus wants to break it, wants to bring in the different. So I would say that this air epoch with the strong influence of Saturn-Uranus brings us two things. Tradition and conserving will need, conserving and tradition will need to work together with innovation. Kind of like this is not a time to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because one cannot have future Uranus without the past Saturn. They have to work together in some way. So think about what's going on right now. As of 2024 still, Uranus is in Taurus. So we've been developing the last few years a new relationship with Earth in the material world. We're noticing reinventions and reassessment with our relationship with resources. Uranus is bringing innovation, new ideas to Taurus, if you think of Taurus in the sense of nature, the body, and our resources. Now, we're also in part two, especially in part two, I touched on a little bit about the waning cycle of Saturn and Uranus, right? They're going to join forces again in 2032. So we're at the very tail end of their full cycle. And so what we're still seeing is how, as they wane, it creates an atmosphere of change versus resistance. Uranus wants change, Saturn speaks to the resistance to change. So again, how can we make these two elements integrate in some shape or form? Saturn is also about that trimming of excesses and brings also the idea of ethical considerations to new technologies, Uranus. And this is especially true now that Pluto arrived in Aquarius. We're starting to really ask ourselves, how are we going to deal with these technologies like social media and AI? What does that mean to us in our future? We're really going to need to be asking ourselves some deep and important questions around the ethics of these technologies. Now, back to the astrologer, the German astrologer Alexander, he highlights something that I thought was really powerful, is that in this new epoch, the new sovereign symbol is the mushroom archetype. And it's interesting because we're having a lot more coming out about the mushroom and the place of the mushroom in our evolution and what it can do and how it can help us. From holistic healing to the environment, there's a lot that we're still going to learn from the mushroom. And I think this is a really good image to hold on to and explore in light of this new epoch. Now, from a personal level, because I think it's important to take consideration about these big cycles and bring it down to our own lives, that's why I keep thinking about the idea that each one of us is a node in the fabric, in the network of society. So how are we treating ourselves? How are we connecting to others? And if you think about Saturn having this element of conservation, right, of a sense of tradition and linking to the past, but also now bringing Uranus with its link to the future, the pole to the future. How does each one of us individually hold the tension of the opposites between future and past, tradition and development, right? So I think, for an example, one element that I see in my work and the people I know and clients is the idea of ancestral healing. And there's a lot, I think that's very Saturnian, and even to me in a certain way linking to the Pluto-Saturn conjunction in Capricorn of let's look to the past. What can we heal in the past? And then we can bring some sort of illumination and freedom, which is deeply linked to Uranus, of that healing of our ancestral line is a way to gain a different kind of freedom so we can move forward without carrying the unconscious elements of the past. So I think that's one way that individually we can work with this epoch change in our personal lives. Now, if we think about the alchemy here is, of course, an air sign, the alchemy of air, makes us think about the idea of the stage in alchemy that is called the sublimation. That's why we have the word sublimation. And this is also highlighted with the fact that Jupiter and Uranus are going to join forces, although they're going to join forces in Taurus, but these two planetary archetypes really relate to this idea of the sublimation, of the elevation, of ascension, of being transported somewhere else. And whenever we're dealing with air or the alchemical stage of sublimation, we're dealing with the process of the intellect and the ability to reflect. We get removed. We have a sense of perspective. Our nose is not so close to the situation. We're able to pull back and see it from a bigger picture and to reflect on it. We need to have a sense of distance. And the air signs bring us that ability, right? Now, to the extreme, it can bring about a sense of separation between mind and body. It brings about this experience of disassociation. It can make us feel disconnected and adrift even. Too much air, too much sublimation, you're disconnected from so-called physical reality. That's what Saturn really represents here. So in dealing with this too, we're going to be noticing themes around the essence of matter and how it transcends and ascends. I think on one hand, we're going to be hearing a lot more about ascension elements. So we want to go up in the skies. We're already seeing this work through they're wanting to do things in the moon and go up to space and go up to Mars. It's as if we want to leave Earth. We just want to get out of here on one hand. But the other side is maybe, hopefully, at a personal level, at a more sort of community level, we're able to have perspective, to pull back, reflect, and transcend away from some elements that are keeping us too blind to what can be done, right? So there's a need for both detachment and perspective. And of course, as with anything, it's hard to find the middle way. Not too much detachment, like I said, can make us feel adrift and lost. But we do need perspective. How do we navigate these times, these Aquarian times? And so at a personal level, the invitation here is, what elements of your life are needing a bit of detachment? Think about the idea of enmeshment when you're too mixed in together, and how sometimes you need to pull away, have a sense of perspective, to see the situation from a different lens. And that way you can relate to it differently, right? So I think we're going to see the tension of the opposites in our culture around that. How do we pull away and gain perspective? And it's going to be challenging. We're already seeing how it is, because go back to part 2 when I talked about the union of Neptune and Pluto in Gemini. The shadow side of Gemini, another air sign, is too much information that can blind us to being able to see the story, right? And so I would say that one of the things that's going to be needed in this epoch is, what is a unifying story that we can have that can help us make sense of what's happening and give us a different kind of perspective, something innovative, but also something that respects the past, because remember, Saturn is also part of this epoch. So the Air Epoch, the truth is about connection and connectivity, and the frequency of the energy that comes forth and affects the entire network. The key word here, I would say, beyond the connection, is network. Of course, we're seeing this word being used a lot in technology, but I invite you to think about the network of your own nervous system, which I feel there's a connection to the Aquarius, your connection between mind and body, your connection within the fabric of your family and your community, and how this then connects us to the bigger community of humanity. I think we're going to be learning a lot about connection, and also its shadow side of disconnection and loss and feeling lonely. This is something already we're seeing as an epidemic, actually. And so how do we rebuild connection? How do we build connection? How do we link up to others? How do we link up to ideas? And how do we move into this new phase without throwing the baby out with the bathwater? So with that, we wrap up part 3. Next week, we're going to be launching part 4, which is the last of this video series on the courageous decade. If you enjoy this, if you find that it's useful, well, share with a friend who you think might also enjoy this type of information. And if you want to, reach out to me via my website and let me know what you thought and what elements stood out to you and how you might even apply that in your own life. All right, signing out. Bye.